Open the door right now. We need to see your ID.
No warrant, no entry.
You're from California, right? So hand over your ID.
I'm a U.S. citizen.
Then prove it right now.
You have no legal basis.
The more you dodge, the more suspicious it looks.
I'm asking you to leave my doorstep.
No, not until you show ID.
The entire dialogue was captured on body camera footage and became the spark for a prejudice-filled misunderstanding. It all started with a vague 911 call, in which a neighbor claimed an unfamiliar black woman from California might not be legally residing there, leading police to believe they had to check ID by any means necessary. In reality, the person being demanded to show papers was Janelle Carter, 34, a U.S. citizen with a stable job in California and no connection whatsoever to any criminal activity. Yet a chain of baseless assumptions escalated into a civil rights lawsuit worth $6.5 million. What made everything spiral so badly? The root of the entire incident began with a 911 call that was filled with speculation rather than facts. A neighbor saw Janelle standing at the front door on the phone, her voice slightly raised due to a tense conversation with a hospital, but the caller interpreted the behavior as not normal. They told the dispatcher they weren't sure she lives here, that the California license plate seemed off, and that an unfamiliar black woman standing at the door looked pretty suspicious. Those inferences were passed to the police almost verbatim, and instead of treating it as subjective opinion, Hardin and Ruiz accepted it as a signal requiring identity verification. In their minds, a black woman from out of state appearing in the neighborhood was reason enough to question her, and suspicion was practically born before they even saw Janelle. When they arrived, their approach wasn't to ask questions or verify basic information. It went straight to demanding she open the door and show ID. A demand with no legal foundation. They didn't need to know what Janelle was doing or whether she legally resided there. To them, her California origin and lack of recognition by the neighbor were sufficient to presume she had to prove herself. And it was from that attitude that the confrontation began sliding toward greater tension. The officers immediately repeated the demand for ID as if it were a self-evident order, even though they had no reasonable suspicion to require Janelle to comply. Hardin said through the door, "Just show your papers and this will go faster." Janelle replied, calmly but firmly, that she was not obligated to show ID without legal grounds and that her right to refuse was clearly protected by law. Ruiz interjected, framing her refusal to open the door as non-cooperation, then asserted they were conducting a residency check, as if labeling the action made it lawful. Every statement they made exposed a power imbalance and a distorted understanding of the law they were relying on. Janelle reiterated that she had not been told any specific reason for the ID demand and that no accusation had been made to justify it. But Hardin ignored this entirely and continued, "You can't prove you live here, and that says a lot." The repeated phrase, "show your papers," became a form of subtle but coercive pressure, as if the law stood behind them rather than alongside the citizen. Janelle explained that the Fourth Amendment protected her from such demands, but they responded, "That's your right in a clear situation. This is a residency check." The error wasn't in their level of knowledge, but in their belief that they held absolute authority to force someone to open their own door. Hardin shifted from request to veiled threat. "The longer you drag this out, the more we suspect why you're avoiding it." Janelle answered that she wasn't avoiding anything. She was simply exercising her civil rights, and their prolonged presence lacked legal basis. Ruiz cut in, "Cooperate and it's over. Don't cooperate and it gets more complicated." Each statement ratcheted up the tension another notch, with the power disparity evident in how they weaponized language. Though Janelle remained calm and consistently explained that refusing to open the door was not obstruction, they kept pivoting toward accusation. Hardin said, "You say that, but we don't know what's happening inside." That statement wasn't based on observation or information. It rested purely on assumption. But they used it as an excuse to keep demanding ID. When Janelle asked what their basis for suspicion was, they didn't answer, and instead looped back to repeating, "Open the door and show ID." Each round of dialogue felt like another tightening loop, not through physical action but through verbal dominance, pushing a citizen's constitutional rights behind unproven assumptions. Their belief that police suspicion, however unfounded, could override Janelle's legal right to refuse marked the point where the confrontation entered a new phase. And at that intersection, where words alone were no longer enough to compel her, Hardin began changing tactics, shifting from demands to manufacturing pretexts by claiming he heard yelling from inside the house, even though Janelle was only speaking through the door in a normal voice with no other sounds present. Ruiz followed with a familiar line heard in many similar situations. I smell marijuana. No evidence, no basis, no real cause. But both used these claims as tools to force Janelle into a defensive position. Those statements weren't meant to describe reality. They were deployed to create the impression that police now had legal justification to demand ID. Janelle responded by asking them to leave the porch, reminding them it was legally rented property and her rights allowed her to refuse contact without cause. Hardin denied it, declaring, "We have the right to stand here until we verify." Janelle reaffirmed that it was protected curtilage and demanded they leave again. But Ruiz interjected, "No, we're here until we see ID." That blunt reply revealed their goal wasn't assessing safety, it was forcing Janelle to produce ID at all costs. Realizing the situation had crossed legal boundaries, Janelle called 911, reporting that police were violating her rights and refusing to leave her porch despite her lack of consent for contact. The dispatcher relayed the message to the officers, but the response Janelle heard was simply, "We're not leaving." No explanation, no legal basis, just the rigid assertion of people who believed they could remain indefinitely. The situation rapidly escalated as Hardin began interpreting every reaction from Janelle in the most unfavorable light. When she said she didn't smell anything, he replied, "Your denial just makes us more suspicious." When she insisted there was no yelling inside, Ruiz said, "You're not objective enough to judge that." Those statements weren't merely illogical, they created a circular trap in which any response from Janelle could be twisted against her. Every line from them carried a layer of psychological pressure with one sole aim to force her to open the door or produce ID. Hardin even added, "We can escalate this if necessary." The word escalate came without specifics but functioned as an indirect threat, heightening tension without creating any legal grounding. Janelle continued stressing that she wasn't required to show ID and that their persistent presence exceeded their authority. Ruiz countered, "If you don't cooperate, we have reason to suspect you're hiding something." Every word from them drilled deeper into the message that their authority was reason enough, and Janelle's refusal was automatically treated as a sign of guilt. This imposition created a deadlock. They kept inventing pretexts, while she kept defending her rights. And when she realized that maintaining distance behind the door would only lead to more baseless accusations piling up, Janelle decided to crack the door just enough to restate her position one final time. She said their demand for ID lacked legal basis, that she wasn't suspected of any crime, and that she had the right to ask them to leave the porch. But the instant the door opened less than a hand's width, Hardin immediately wedged his foot in the gap, as though he had been waiting for exactly that moment to shift from verbal pressure to a further step, without the slightest legal justification. "Step outside right now," Hardin said, his voice not loud but heavily commanding. Janelle objected, stating she did not consent to their entry and that cracking the door was neither an invitation nor agreement. But Hardin reframed it. "You opened the door, which means you want to talk face to face." Ruiz, standing behind, immediately chimed in, "We need to ensure safety. Come out and show ID." No lawful reason was given, but their statements were arranged so that any reaction from Janelle would be deemed non-cooperation. As Janelle tried to keep the door from opening further, Hardin pushed harder with his already placed foot. In an instant, he grabbed the edge of the door while Ruiz stepped forward, seized Janelle's arm and yanked her outside without any prior lawful command. It all happened in mere seconds, but it was enough to transform Janelle from a citizen standing inside her home into someone forcibly subdued right on her own threshold. Ruiz spun her around, pulled her arms behind her back, and handcuffed her without explaining the reason, stating any charge or reading any rights. This was not an action to protect safety. It was the outcome of a chain of assumptions they had constructed and used as pretext to exceed the power the law permitted. When Janelle asked why she was being cuffed, Hardin replied, "You failed to cooperate with the residency check." That answer was not a legal justification. It was merely the continuation of their mistaken belief that they could demand ID from anyone they chose. Ruiz then searched her jacket pocket, removed her wallet without consent or legal basis, opened it, pulled out her California ID, looked at it and paused silently for a few seconds. No violation, no issue with the documents, no crime, just a black woman with valid ID from another state. Even so, Hardin still said, "This ID doesn't prove you live here," as though that were sufficient to justify everything they had just done. While Janelle remained handcuffed, they continued going through her wallet and found nothing that could relate to any accusation, because from the beginning no genuine accusation had ever existed. The truth was laid bare. the moment the ID was pulled out. Everything that led to this confrontation was not criminal behavior, but prejudice about skin color license plate. In a neighbor's speculation, prejudice that Hardin and Ruiz had accepted almost unchanged, and then turned into a pretext for asserting power. After being handcuffed and placed in the squad car, Janelle was held at the station for hours without any specific explanation. No one stated a charge, no one said what she was being investigated for, and no one acknowledged that her entire detention stemmed from unfounded guesses. When they released her, there was no citation, no charge, no document claiming she had done anything wrong. Everything ended as it began, irrational, arbitrary, and completely untethered from the law. But in that moment, what Janelle endured went far beyond unlawful detention. It was living proof of how prejudice and abuse of power can combine to strip away a person's most basic freedom right at their own doorstep. And because of that, when the body camera footage capturing the entire confrontation was extracted and quickly spread after a neighbor shared additional footage from their window, the story was no longer confined to Janelle's personal experience. Lines like, "Open the door right now, you're from California, right?" and "Show your papers" immediately became the focus of public debate, clearly showing the encounter had no legal foundation whatsoever. Public pressure mounted, and Janelle understood that silence would only allow the matter to fade. So she decided to file a lawsuit under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, alleging that Hardin, Ruiz, and the city of Mesa had seriously violated her Fourth Amendment rights to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. The complaint detailed the sequence from unlawful ID demand, misinterpretation of her right to refuse entry, baseless pretext creation, all the way to searching her wallet and handcuffing without any charge. When the suit was filed, the city opened an internal investigation, and early results showed this was not the first time Hardin and Ruiz had been accused of overstepping authority. Hardin's personnel file included 3 prior complaints about unnecessarily prolonging citizen contacts and making prejudiced remarks about subjects' places of residence. Ruiz had been reprimanded 2 years earlier for demanding papers from a young man without reasonable suspicion. Though those prior complaints had not led to serious discipline, they became background evidence of a recurring pattern. By the time the trial date arrived, the courtroom was packed. The case had drawn national media attention, not only for the civil rights violation, but also for its parallels to previous incidents involving ID demands, based on bias. The trial opened with the playing of the body camera video. The room fell silent as Hardin's voice rang out. "Open the door right now. We need to see your ID." There was no pounding on the door in the footage, no disruptive noise as Hardin had claimed to hear. It was purely a tense verbal exchange, and the complete absence of any sign of danger made the video even more powerful evidence. When the recording reached the moment Hardin wedged his foot in the door, many in the courtroom involuntarily raised their eyebrows. It was the instant that showed his action was not about safety, but about forcing Janelle outside. Next came Janelle's testimony. She spoke clearly and coherently about being demanded ID without cause, about police refusing to leave her porch despite her lack of consent for contact, and about the shock of being pulled out and handcuffed right at the door of the home she legally rented. She affirmed there was no indication whatsoever that could justify police suspecting her of a crime, and their interpretation of her lawful actions as non-cooperation was a manifestation of abuse of power. The plaintiff called a Fourth Amendment legal expert to analyze the entire sequence. He pointed out each violation, demanding ID without reasonable suspicion, remaining on the curtilage after the homeowner demanded they leave, false claims of yelling or marijuana smell to justify prolonging contact, forcing the door open by wedging a foot, searching the wallet without consent, handcuffing without any charge. He explained that these were not isolated errors but a systematic chain of violations, with each step breaching a layer of constitutional protection designed to prevent abuse of power. When the officers took the stand, the contradictions between their testimony and the video became glaring. Hardin insisted he heard yelling, but the video captured no such sound. Ruiz claimed he smelled marijuana, yet the footage showed no reaction or indication of it. When asked for the basis to call Janelle evasive and suspicious, both fell back on vague phrases like officer instinct or unclear behavior. Janelle's attorney needed only to juxtapose each of their statements against the video's audio and visuals to demonstrate that the reasons they gave did not exist. In closing arguments, the plaintiff contended that the entire incident stemmed not from any safety risk or criminal conduct, but from bias against a black woman from out of state. What made it so serious was not just the abuse of power in the moment of confrontation, but the lasting consequences to Janelle's mental well-being, dignity, and personal security. The jury took less than a day to reach a verdict. They found that the officers had violated the Fourth Amendment, that Janelle's seizure and detention were unlawful, and that the city was liable for its employees' conduct. The damages awarded totaled $6.5 million, covering emotional distress, reputational harm, economic losses, and punitive damages to send a clear message about accountability. That verdict was not only recognition that Janelle had been wronged, but also an affirmation that constitutional rights cannot be bent by baseless assumptions or personal prejudice. After the verdict was announced, Janelle decided the compensation should not merely reimburse what she had endured, but should become a tool to protect others from similar circumstances. She allocated a significant portion to establish a fund supporting victims of constitutional rights violations, focusing on cases involving unlawful ID demands, baseless detention, or treatment based on racial or origin-based prejudice. Her fund provides legal assistance, filing fees, civil rights counseling, and community guidance on recognizing abuse of power. In parallel, the city of Mesa was required to review and update its entire citizen contact procedures in similar situations, especially rules regarding ID demands, the right to refuse contact, limits on residency checks, and obligations to adhere to constitutional standards during initial encounters. Several key changes were implemented, including mandatory retraining for officers, stricter internal oversight mechanisms, and more transparent video storage and release systems. These changes do not erase what happened, but they are evidence that Janelle's lawsuit produced real impact on the system. From her story, the biggest lesson is probably the irreplaceable role of body cameras. Without footage recording every word, every baseless demand, and every overreach, the truth could have been reversed or obscured by inaccurate accounts. The camera does not just record truth, it forces all parties to be accountable to that truth. But equally important is another lesson: knowing one's individual rights is a citizen's first and most fundamental layer of protection. Janelle did not shout or resist physically, she simply knew her rights and stood firm in them. And that became the anchor when the entire system began re-examining the conduct of those who violated them. At the end of this story, the question is not only for the city or law enforcement, but for everyone who believes justice must be seen and enforced in its true essence. If you are interested in stories about civil rights, accountability, and how truth can change an entire system, please continue following so you don't miss any developments in future cases.